Ambassadors. Some of you are brand new to ambassadors. Some of you have been doing this for a while. But this is our third deep dive of 2019 and our final one. We're talking about aquatic invasive species today.
So we're going to go through just a little bit of background on aquatic invasive species, and then we'll talk about sort of the two key areas that the Alliance has focused our policy work on around invasive species: ballast water, I'll explain what ballast water is, and Asian carp, and then we'll talk about some next steps. So I'm going to cover a lot of material. There's going to be a bunch of information that's on the screen that is really intended so that all of you can take these slides home and have them as a resource or for some background information. So I'm not going to read every single thing that's on the screen, but if there's something that you want more information on or want me to dig into a little bit more, I'm happy to do that. And if at any point I'm covering something that you're like, I am really confused, I don't understand, just holler, those of you on the phone or those of you here, wave, and I will pause. And we've intentionally tried to leave a lot of time for questions as well. So first, just a definition of, trying to explain what is an invasive species. And basically that's a non-native species that is going to cause some sort of harm, whether it's environmental harm, economic harm, harm to human health. That's sort of the national definition of invasive species. And we're going to talk about AIS, which is aquatic invasive species. So there are other critters, like you've probably heard of, like the emerald ash borer or some other invasive plants and things like that we won't necessarily get into today because they're more terrestrial focused. They're a major problem, just not within the scope of the Alliance's mission. And you'll often hear in talking about this issue, non-native species, nuisance species, exotic species. Those kind of all mean different things in the scientific community, but a lot of times people and policymakers sort of use all of those words interchangeably, rightly or wrongly. It happens. Go to the next slide. So this is not intended for everybody to really read, but what the point here is that we have over 180 non-native aquatic invasive species that have been introduced into the Great Lakes. That is a phenomenal number, particularly when you consider, I think there's something like 130 native fish species, and 30-ish of those, on top of that, there are 30-ish non-native fish species. So this is a huge number that have been brought into the Great Lakes region. You go to the next slide. So what are some of the impacts of aquatic invasive species, or AIS? So they compete for food, they outcompete native species, they sometimes eat native species, they put the food chain out of whack, sometimes in ways that we don't even predict and really don't see for years until they've been fully established in the Great Lakes region. They also cost us as taxpayers and municipal ratepayers at water and sewer districts a lot of money every year. The Great Lakes region alone spends about $200 million a year to control invasive species. And so that's for things like, you've heard of zebra and quagga mussels. They're these little tiny mussels that we'll have a picture of in a minute, that clog up the water intake pipes. So, your water districts are having to spend a lot of money to treat their water pipes so that they don't get zebra mussels in there. That adds up over time. So we're spending a lot of money out of our taxpayer pockets to address this problem. The big thing to remember is that once an invasive species is introduced, it is virtually impossible to eradicate. Some of them, you may have heard of a species called sea lamprey, which has been around for a long time. They have been somewhat controlled, but that costs millions of dollars a year forever. You can't stop. You can't be like, I don't want to pay for that this year, because then the sea lamprey will come back. So our biggest goal here at the Alliance is to focus on preventing new species from establishing in the Great Lakes. Next slide. So how do aquatic invasive species sort of become established? Here's a list of some of the ways that they can come in. The vast majority of these aquatic invasive species, particularly since the 1950s, have come in through ballast water in ships. And I'll talk a little bit more about specifically what ballast water is. There are other ways. Aquaculture escape, we'll talk about that specifically related to Asian carp. That's how they were introduced. You can have, birds flying over, dropping seeds or whatnot. Recreational boating, you have a boat moving from one watershed to another. And there are some programs for those other issues, particularly around recreational boating. There's a big education program out there. But the vast majority are coming in through shipping. Next slide. So what is ballast, if that's the main pathway? So a ship, so if you picture in your head those huge ships that ply the Great Lakes, when they are onloading or offloading goods, or when they are transiting and they're not totally full, they have little tanks, little compared to their cargo holds. They have tanks along the sides of their vessel that are ballast tanks. And so they'll pour in water into those tanks to keep them stable. If they're not carrying any goods, or if they're loading and unloading, you could imagine that you might have part of your ship that's empty and part not. You want to keep your vessel stable. So they're a really important role in keeping in safety around shipping. And there's some graphics there that sort of show how that works. But when they are loading and unloading that ballast water, they are sucking in whatever is in that water. So it could be plants, it could be animals, it could be viruses, it could be all kinds of gunk that's ending up in those ballast holds. Next slide. So this is looking at the different ways, all of those different pathways, which is what the tall bars are in the different colors. Red is ballast water. The introduction of invasive species over time. So the bottom is by decades, starting in the sort of mid-1800s. And you see a big spike starting in about the 1950s in that decade. In 1959, that is when the St. Lawrence Seaway went online, and the St. Lawrence Seaway became that direct pathway for ocean-going vessels to enter the Great Lakes. Before, vessels just kind of transited within the lakes, which caused its own problems, and there was some spread of invasive species at that time. But that is when we started to see this huge spike in aquatic invasive species coming into the Great Lakes, and you can see that through those red bars. That's what the number of species brought in by ballast per those decades. Next. So I do want to take a pause and help people see the big picture, because not everybody always thinks about the big picture or can quite visualize it. So this is just a map showing those shipping pathways. On the right-hand side of the screen, that's the Gulf of St. Lawrence, so connected to the ocean. That's how your ships are going to come through. The box on the picture, that shows what's considered the St. Lawrence Seaway. That area near between to the right, sort of the north of Ogdensburg, that's where the locks and dams were that were created to allow those vessels to get through the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes. And then obviously once in the Great Lakes, the ships can transit around. So that's just sort of a little visual to help you picture it all. So these are just some of the sort of big name aquatic invasive species that have been brought in by ballast tanks. A lot of them you've probably heard of. We talked a little bit about the zebra and quagga mussels. They are teeny little, maybe an inch or so long mussels that have just completely taken over the ecosystem. I was just talking with someone the other day who was doing some research looking at like the deepest depths of Lake Michigan, which is, I'm not gonna remember the number, but it's really, really deep.
600 plus.
Something, yeah, it's super deep. He said that when they go down there with these automated vehicles and they're sort of looking around, it's just coated. All they see is zebra mussels and quagga mussels. So it's a major problem. Spiny water flea, they're tiny, like little microscopic things that sort of clog up your fishing lines, but they also are a major problem. The round goby, yeah, you may have heard of, the Eurasian ruff. So those are just a couple of the kind of big name ones that have been introduced by ballast water. So cleaning up ship ballast tanks is the most effective way to prevent new aquatic invasive species introductions into the Great Lakes. You'll hear opponents to some of the regulations say, oh, it's all the fault of recreational boaters, or wow, those ducks that migrate, they're a big problem. Yes, they do introduce some invasive species, but it's not at the rate and the scale of ship ballast tanks. The Alliance for the Great Lakes has been a major leader in the regional campaign to pressure federal regulatory agencies and Congress to regulate ship ballast tanks. And when I talk about regulation, really what that means is that there would be a standard for when a ship is discharging that ballast water, they would have to comply with a set standard of for lack of a better term, cleanliness of that water. It might require treatment technologies to be put on board a vessel, or they could have like a shoreside treatment system that's been floated at various ports or some of those choke points along the seaway system where they have to go through a lot. Those are some of the things that have been floated, but there would be a technological solution required to treat that water before they dump it into the Great Lakes. The Alliance has also supported, obviously we've worked a lot at the federal level, we've also supported Great Lakes states as they have tried to implement their own ballast regulations. For instance, Minnesota, Michigan, and New York have passed their own laws to varying degrees of success. Some other states in the country like California and Washington State have also passed laws, and we've been supportive of those efforts. Next. So there's a lot of detail here. But it's sort of a timeline of kind of where we've been on this issue and where we are going. So 1959, we talked about that. That's when the St. Lawrence Seaway officially opened, and that sort of opened those floodgates for aquatic invasive species to be brought in by ballast water on ships. In the mid-1980s, that's when zebra mussels were discovered in the Great Lakes. And it's starting at that time, the researchers were really raising the alarm bell saying, whoa, we know this is going to be a massive problem. We need to start doing something about it now. Unfortunately, there was a lot of opposition by the shipping industry, some resistance by some of the regulatory agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Coast Guard. And so there was a lot of back and forth in the 80s and 90s, to sum that up. But in 1993, there were some voluntary rules put into place which required those ocean-going vessels, which are called salties, as they cross the ocean, to take that water in their tanks, dump it out into the ocean, put in some salt water, slosh it around. The term, I'm not kidding you, used by the shipping industry was swish and spit. My favorite little tidbits there. But the idea was that that really high salinity open ocean water might be able to kill any freshwater species in there. It helped. It wasn't perfect. In 2008 and 2013, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was forced, because of several lawsuits, to issue some regulations on this. And then after that, the shipping industry went to Congress and said, okay, we now have a problem. We have various states that have passed ballast water cleanup regulations. We have the EPA working on its regulatory process, and they ended up with a patchwork of regulations. And the shipping industry said, we just want one national standard. There was a huge fight for many years over a bill called VITA, the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. And the Alliance was really at the forefront, leading the coalition to strengthen that, to make it as protective of the lakes and our other inland waterways as possible. That finally passed in 2018. It wasn't perfect. And from our perspective, one of the big issues is that it doesn't include lakers. And so lakers are those vessels that stay within the Great Lakes. They don't go out to the ocean. They are not introducing new species, but they do play a role in spreading species around. So that's still a concern that we have. Canada has its own regulatory process. They're working with an international organization called the International Maritime Organization. Essentially, their regulations will be somewhat similar, but they have a separate process underway. And right now, we are waiting for the Environmental Protection Agency and the Coast Guard to release their new regulations under this VITA law that was passed in 2018. So more to come, but that's where that stands right now. I'm going to skip past that. That's some definitions of stuff on the prior slide.
And just for the people on the phone, I will send out this presentation as it is, as well as a handout.
Got it. Okay, so moving on from there to our other favorite topic, Asian carp. And what you see there in that picture are silver carp, which are some of the ones that are kind of the most dramatic. You see the videos of these ones sort of jumping up out of the water, whacking boaters, and some people think that's kind of funny, but if you were trying to boat with your family, it would not be so funny. It's also really gross when they land in your boat, because one of their defense mechanisms is to bleed out their gills. So not only are they whacking you in the head, but then they're like sliming and bleeding, and it's just disgusting. So as everybody here eats their dinner. So Asian carp, as we sort of mentioned before, they were imported in the 1970s for use in aquaculture ponds in some of the southern states in the United States. These huge aquaculture ponds had problems with algae. If you can imagine, you have a whole lot of fish you're trying to grow in one spot. Somebody thought they were super smart and said, hey, there's these fish from Asia. They're really great at eating algae. And so they put them in the aquaculture ponds. They didn't think or really prepare to mitigate the issue that those aquaculture ponds flooded regularly. And so when the aquaculture ponds flooded, the regular fish and the Asian carp got out into the Mississippi River, and they've been slowly making their way north ever since. One wrinkle in all of this that is really important to remember is, so it's bad, right, that the Asian carp are making their way up the Mississippi River. However, way back in 1900, the city of Chicago reversed the Chicago River. Part of that, and there are a whole lot of reasons because of that, but the biggest problem was that the Chicago River was extremely polluted, and when it was flowing out into Lake Michigan, all that pollution was flowing right to the drinking water intakes and going right back into the city. It was a vicious cycle. The city decided to reverse the Chicago River, which isn't very big, and connect it over to the Mississippi River Basin and just flush all of that nastiness away. As you can imagine, downstate communities in Illinois were not very excited about that. But the problem is that natural divide between the Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes Basin no longer exists. If those two waterways were separated, the carp would be kind of going on their merry way and not be able to swim directly into Lake Michigan. Because of that connection between the two basins, the carp theoretically can just kind of swim their way into Lake Michigan. So we have them being released from these aquaculture ponds, moving their way north. Chicago has made this historic decision many, many years ago, and here we are with a problem on our hands because those fish are about 60 miles away from Lake Michigan, swimming up the Illinois waterway. The two fish that are moving on their way are silver and bighead carp, and we talked a little bit about silver carp and the problems they cause earlier. Go next. So why are we worried about Asian carp? Obviously, we have the problem of them jumping. That would be a huge threat to the recreational boating industry, which is about a $16 billion a year industry around the Great Lakes region. They are huge filter feeders. They're like, I think of them like these massive Hoover vacuum cleaners. They outcompete native fish species for food. They grow really, really fast, and they reproduce multiple times a year. So they're growing fast, they're eating all the food, and they're spawning. They are highly adaptable to different environments. A statistic that always amazes me, in some parts of the Illinois River, Asian carp account for about 90% of the biomass. So they are just taking over everything. If introduced into the Great Lakes, obviously they would be catastrophic to the ecosystem, but they would also be economically catastrophic, potentially impacting the $7 billion a year sport fishing industry, and also I mentioned the recreational boating industry. Next slide. Okay, so here's a map of kind of where things stand right now with Asian carp. If you look at the sort of bottom middle, there's a map of Illinois, and this pull-out section in the whole map here is sort of northeastern Illinois, the Chicago area. So you see Lake Michigan on the upper right. The three red dots there, those are the three control points separating Lake Michigan and managing the water flow between the lake and the Chicago waterway. If you look over onto the left side, the squiggly line is the Des Plaines River, which connects to the Illinois River. And that red, orange, yellow into the green part about where it says Dresden Pool there, that's the various stages of where Asian carp are. It goes from a fully established population to a pretty close to established population to we think they might be spawning to what they call the leading edge, which is where they know there's adult carp swimming out there, but they aren't officially spawning or, established yet. So as you can see, that's basically showing the carp kind of creeping their way up. You can see in kind of a orangey color, a line pointing to the electric barriers. There are a series of electric barriers that were put into operation in the early 2000s that were an attempt to prevent invasive species from going both ways, right? So as you can imagine, there are critters in the Mississippi River that we don't want into Lake Michigan, but also the people in the Mississippi Basin don't want the critters we have in the Great Lakes to get down their way. The electric barriers are what they sound like. The water is essentially electrified. Vessels can get through. It's mostly barge shipping at that point. They're not foolproof. They are essentially our only and current line of defense right now, but they are not foolproof. Fish can get through. You also can see there's a red dot next to where it says Brandon Road Pool. I don't know if you can use right about there. I don't know if oh, nope, the one right down. Yep. That is the Brandon Road Lock and Dam. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but that is sort of a major focal point because it's kind of a choke point in the system. And there are proposals that we'll talk about in a minute or two to install some additional protection measures at that point. Next. Okay, so some recent history. I talked a little bit about the electric barrier. The Alliance for the Great Lakes was one of the first organizations to propose the idea of what we call restoring the natural divide. Like, what would happen if we said, nope, we're not going to allow those Mississippi Basin waterways to connect to the Great Lakes? It's a huge idea, a huge concept, but before that point, everybody had said, that's ridiculous. It's now become slowly more and more an idea that people are thinking about. People are trying to understand how we might be able to make happen. For those of you not in Chicago, or maybe those of you in Chicago, all of the city of Chicago's infrastructure is based around moving our waste and water away from Lake Michigan. So it's a huge effort. I'm not originally from Chicago. So before I moved here, I was like, we'll just dump in a bunch of rocks and make a dam and be done with it. Unfortunately, it isn't quite that simple. But the Alliance for the Great Lakes has been one of the organizations that has pushed this idea forward and has helped to sort of slowly make it become a little bit more mainstream. There was a series of lawsuits starting in 2009. There's been decades and decades of lawsuits over the Chicago reversal from other Great Lakes states. In 2009, Michigan reopened those lawsuits, and Michigan sued the state of Illinois, claiming that the state of Illinois was not moving quickly enough to take action to stop Asian carp. Ultimately, the judge, the long story short, said, we're going to give Illinois some more time, but that's still sort of lurking out there because Michigan could still try and reopen that, and a judge could reassess that decision about whether or not things are moving fast enough. In 2010, Congress directed the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to undertake a huge study that was called, a really unfortunate acronym that's pronounced GLIMERIS, which is the Great Lakes Mississippi River Interbasin Study. It's a mouthful. And essentially what that was to do was to sort of look at the options for what the potential problems were, which we kind of know, but really established what are all of the different invasive species that could be going from basin to basin, what are the biggest risks, what are some of the options for addressing these problems. It was a huge, long study. The long story short was that the study basically said, yep, Asian carp are our #1 concern, and we got to do something about it, and here are some ideas. And so that study sort of wrapped up roughly about 2015, and it really focused attention on that Brandon Road Lock and Dam location that I pointed out before, because that's a choke point in the system where we could install some additional measures to keep Asian carp from moving closer to Lake Michigan. I forgot to mention in 2012, a big report was released by the Great Lakes Commission and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. So those are two organizations that represent the states and cities of the Great Lakes region, and they began to talk about this idea of restoring that natural divide. So progress was moving around saying, how might we deal with this bigger problem? Next. I won't get into that because it's some definitions based on the prior slide, so you have those. So this is an aerial photo of that Brandon Road Lock and Dam. It's near Joliet, Illinois, just sort of south of us on the Des Plaines River. And the Asian carp would be on the sort of bottom right side of the slide and would be moving towards the upper left, right? So you can see you have the lock there, which is allowing those vessels to go through. And on the top middle, you can see parts of a dam. that dam is really high, so the fish couldn't like jump over it. So they're really, other than going through that lock facility, they're not going to be able, the Asian carp can't get past that. So that's why that's become such an important point in this process. Next. So a year ago, the U.S. Army Corps then produced another study. They do lots of studies that really nailed down and laid out the specifics for what they would install at the Brandon Road facility. And what you see there is they are proposing things like some additional electric barriers, some underwater acoustic and bubble measures. The fish don't like sound and bubbles. That deters them. There would be some mechanisms to essentially flush out the lock each time to make sure nothing's going through with the vessels. And so it's a whole suite of things that could be built there that sort of, somebody described it as the Asian carp gauntlet. Like it would be really hard for an Asian carp to make it through all of those things to keep going forward. So that's a little bit about what's being proposed there right now. So there are two sets of next steps on this issue. The first is the state of Illinois has to take some action because this project would be built on Illinois soil, and there are rules and various regulations by the Army Corps to make sure that the states are essentially on board with any projects that they are going to be building as the federal government. So as far as the building that project at Brandon Road, Illinois Governor Pritzker has been generally supportive of the issue. For those of you not from Illinois, Governor Pritzker is relatively recently elected, so he's a new-ish governor. And his support is frankly a shift from prior administrations, which had been resistant to this project. What we need right now and what we're pushing for right now is to get Governor Pritzker, he has to sign an agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers that says, yep, we want to start moving forward with this project. We commit to being a partner in this project. The Army Corps will not move forward with building anything until, or even starting to officially design things until Illinois signs off on this letter. So we're waiting for the governor to sign this letter. The next phase of the project is a mouthful. It's called Pre-Construction Engineering and Design. You've got to love the Army Corps of Engineers with all of their terminology, but that's the important next step. And so we are waiting for Governor Pritzker to sign this letter, and we have been doing a lot of advocacy to get him to sign on. A good sign is that Illinois has included some funding for this part of the process. So we start to move into a phase where there's some cost share between the federal government and the states. And Illinois has included some funding. But what's also really important to recognize is that other states around the Great Lakes region are so concerned about this issue is they've said, you know what, Illinois, we're going to help you pay for it. Michigan specifically has allocated about $8 million to the project. So that's a really good sign because Illinois, for those of us who live there, we have some serious budgetary issues, and that's been a hurdle. So the other states are saying, look, we will help you step up and pay for this project. Next slide. At the federal,
how long has Governor Pritzker's signature been pending on this letter?
A couple of months.
Okay.
Yes.
So, okay, I'll let you go.
Okay.
I remember reading about him being in favor of it and proud to take the step forward. I just I wonder why 2 months has gone by and he hasn't done anything yet.
It's okay yet.
There are complicated politics on this issue within the state of Illinois.
I'm sure there are.
We also know that one of the big concerns that Governor Pritzker has raised is when the Army Corps of Engineers released that study saying, okay, here's all the stuff that we want to do at Brandon Road. They released a rough estimate for the project, which was in the billions of dollars. We've looked at those numbers, and it includes some inflated costs for potential project overruns, which we don't think are they've included way more for project overruns than they have ever included in any other similar projects, right? The Army Corps says, well, this is untested technology. We don't know much about this. We can have a debate about that. we won't know an actual cost until we get into this pre-construction engineering and design phase, because that's where they will actually draw up the drawings, have the engineering stuff. So one of the things that we know Governor Pritzker has been concerned about is he doesn't want to commit the state to a huge potential cost with a cost being unknown. And we're in a catch-22, which we've been talking with his staff about a lot. We have to have a signature to move forward to get an actual cost, but he doesn't want to move forward because he doesn't know the actual cost. I think that they are hopefully getting over that hurdle right now. And it has been helpful that many other Great Lakes states are stepping up and saying, hey, we are going to be here to help you cover this cost share. We are all really concerned about this. The other Great Lakes states are saying we don't think it's fair that Illinois would have to bear the whole cost burden of this project. And so we are hopeful that that is persuasive to the governor. Does that help? It's not a very satisfying answer, but that's the best I've got.
No, it does help. I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, it does help a lot. Thanks.
Yeah. And this is my last slide anyway, so it was a good time to start moving towards questions. Just really quickly at the federal level, the congressional budget, whenever it is passed, we won't talk about the dysfunction of Congress these days. They are under something called a continuing resolution. They were supposed to have had their budget passed by October 1st. In that budget, they have directed the Army Corps of Engineers to, here's some money, get to work on that pre-construction engineering design process. So once the governor signs, the Corps can move as quickly as the Corps ever moves. And the next step is we're really looking to Congress, and we're starting our lobbying right now to get Congress to authorize construction, because once they design it, then they're going to have to actually build it. So getting started moving on that process and getting all of the various bills, the biggest being the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, to make sure that the path is ready when the Army Corps is ready to build this thing. I think the next slide is just questions. I do want to say, as far as a specific item for all of you around Asian carp, we are going to be putting out an action alert early next week aimed at Governor Pritzker, saying, hey, Gov, we're really excited that you have been supportive of this project, but you got to sign that letter. Look, we need you to move along. And one of our big messages to Governor Pritzker is this is an opportunity for him as a new governor to really step up and lead in the Great Lakes region and be a leader amongst all of the other Great Lakes states. And so keep an eye out for that action alert. If you aren't signed up for our action alert, I think Katie has some information here on how to sign up. And then when you do see that, we encourage you to share, send it around to folks, and get as many people as you can to sign on to that letter, whether you live in Illinois or not. We want letters from all around the region so that he can see the importance of this to his supporters, his constituents rather, and people around the Great Lakes region.
And when